Good evening, everybody. To know yup is a phrase that I just learned in the Squamish language that means greeting to more than one person. Thank you all for coming and joining us this evening. My name is Carrie. I am a project coordinator on the Indigenous Specific Anti-Racism and Cultural Safety team at Doctors of BC. I'm joining tonight from the unceded and ancestral territory of the Squamish First Nation. And I would also like to recognize that Doctors of BC operates on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Acknowledging the traditional territories of our First Nations communities in the province is something that we do to express cultural humility in an effort to recognize our desire to support the provision of culturally safe care to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people in British Columbia. I am very happy to introduce you this evening to Jordan White and Samantha Jack from Len Pierre Consulting, who are going to facilitate this session for us. We would like to also please ask you to submit any questions into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen along your Zoom toolbar. We're trying to keep the chat to a minimum and just focus the questions in the Q&A section if possible. Thank you. And Jordan and Samantha, I turn it over to you.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for that beautiful opening and welcome. Swale Saya, Jordan Telsqui, Talitokwa, Boni Boni B, Cree Nation, and Mistawasas First Nation. Good evening, friends and relatives. I'm Jordan. My Indigenous roots come from northern Manitoba, which is Boni Boni B, Cree Nation, as well as central Saskatchewan, Mistawasas First Nation. I currently belong to the Mid-Island Métis Nation and am transferring to the Fraser Valley one, where I currently reside on the shared territory of Lekamel, Sumas, Matsqui, and Kwantlen First Nations, which colonially known as Mission, British Columbia. I'm a proud Métis citizen, and a lot of my teachings, a lot of my sharing comes back to the Métis flag. When I think about difficulties and struggles that I've had in the past, I come back to that Métis flag about relationships, balance, weaving together of knowledge systems, and really focusing on dialogue over debate. And just a little bit more about myself, and this is part of decolonial work, decolonizing methodologies, that self-location aspect. About myself, 22, 23 years ago, I attempted suicide, and I found myself in psychiatric facilities, found myself in treatment. I wouldn't be alive today if it wasn't for Western medicine, Western treatment, Western approaches. And I also went into Indigenous healing programs, Indigenous treatment programs, finding the beat of your drum, which is a treatment program. Also attended a canoe journey, and my voice is much stronger. My way I hold myself is much deeper, and I'm able to really have that good balance with both Western and Indigenous ways of knowing, doing, and being. And that's going to be informed today in some of the sharing that I have. My background's in counseling, and so some of the stories and clinical work that I spend with clients, I'm going to share some of that in the second half of today's presentation. But I just want to invite Samantha up to open herself up and to share herself in a good way, and then we'll continue with the PowerPoint. Hi, Chikasia.
Chichim Hekwa Iklama Samantha Jack. Hi everyone, my name is Samantha Jack. I come from Nuchanuth and Yale First Nations, specifically from Muachut-Muchlit, which is also known colonially as Gold River on the west coast of Vancouver Island on my father's side. And I also come from Ruby Creek, Reserve number 2, not the first one, but the second one, which is just on the north side of the Fraser River, just before Hope, on my mother's side, who've since urbanized to Vancouver. I would also like to acknowledge and honor my godfather, my uncle, who is Chief Raymond Wilson, of Halitsim First Nation, where they settled in Canoe Pass, which is now known as Ladner, in the Lower Mainland, but they traveled between Canoe Pass, Penelakut, and Cowichan territories. And it was a really great honor to be able to grow up with his influence and guidance and love. um, I always like to come into these spaces, whether virtually or in person, with a lot of my own humility as well. And it comes with the acknowledgement of my age and my experience and where I have been in life. And I always like to voice that. I think it's really important to be transparent and accountable and approach this in a good way. Recognizing that I don't claim to be an expert. I'm just a youth, but I've been facilitating for about 7 years now on various topics, and working very closely with my Friendship Center in Surrey, the Fraser Region Aboriginal Friendship Center Association. And through that, I've been elected as the National Youth Executive with the National Association of Friendship Centers. So through my experience here and the guidance that I've been given through our amazing, I guess CEO is his official term, but to me, he's a friend, a brother, Len Pierre, who's from Katesy First Nation, settled here in what's known as, you know, Walnut Grove and Pitt Meadows area in the Lower Mainland. Really, Jordan and I couldn't be able to do this work without Len and in these capacities. So really honored to be here and to share a bit of my own experience with my family and how I grew up, and offering a different perspective. So often we don't hear that in certain spaces, and so often we don't read of that in certain spaces. So just really excited to be able to share today. So thank you for having me.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Samantha. And there's just one additional point we want to share, and then we'll have a PowerPoint and that's focused on decolonizing substance use. This is a shortened version of the 3.5 hour one that we do, so some pieces might be sped up a bit just for the sake of time. But what we want to just really highlight, and perhaps you've already seen in the news in terms of decriminalization and what's happening throughout the country right now. I was chatting with Len a bit earlier today, and we really want to just emphasize some of our LPC or Len Pierre Consulting perspectives on that, because everyone here knows how tense and how polarizing it is. So we just want to highlight a few things, and then that'll really lead nicely into the PowerPoint. First of all, when we think about substance use and addiction, it's very much a health issue, not a criminal issue. And I think it's really important to look at colonial policies, racist policies such as prohibition, and how that perpetuates harm to our Black, Indigenous, people of color, our LGBTQ folks, immigrants, and refugees, because we know they're disproportionately affected by this toxic drug poisoning crisis. And when we think about our friends and our relatives, so many people are dying in our communities. It's hard in my heart because I work in a lot of these communities, and I know you guys do too. And so I'm just wanted to share that aspect about looking and really highlighting how prohibition and other colonial policies contribute to that. Secondly, prioritizing dialogue over debate. And we know that debate is a tool of patriarchy that creates a lot of division and creates a lot of polarization and creates a lot of winner and loser type scenarios. And so I find that moving towards dialogue and prioritizing dialogue much more effective, much more generative than the polarizing nature of debate. And I'm informed by someone by the name of Thich Nhat Hanh, who's a Buddhist monk. He in these scenarios in terms of dialogue, he says to speak the truth, but not to punish. And I found that really moving for me, is to speak the truth and not to punish in all the environments I find myself in. And the last aspect is centering our common humanity, or what's also known as all my relations, the four-legged, the two-legged, the ones that swim, the ones that crawl, the ones that fly, the planted, the rooted, the finned, the feathered, all these aspects, the land, the water, the trees, the cosmos, is all of our relations. And so we need to keep that in mind as we move forward with this work. The colonial racist policies such as prohibition, privileging dialogue, centering all my relations, and it's a health issue, not a criminal issue. Is that's some specific pieces we want to mention in terms of a LPC perspective on the decriminalization aspect. Please feel free to use the chat box there as mentioned. I'm just going to bring up the PowerPoint here, and Sam's going to lead us through the first number of slides, and then I'll share some clinical aspects of my work with young people, individuals, families, communities in my experience with in the Fraser Valley primarily. So I'll come to the next slide here, and Sam, I'm coming to you here. I'm going to mute myself.
Yes, thank you. So often when we look at, you know, this idea, this concept of the war on drugs, I am so sorry, my roommates are being very loud. I'm gonna go tell them to be quiet for 1 second. I'm so sorry. This is what happens when you are a youth that's forced to live with a bunch of roommates in this horrible housing crisis. So I'll be 2 seconds. I'm so sorry.
I'll just share a few aspects while she's speaking to them, and you know, one of the aspects I just want to really highlight, and when I mentioned prohibition, you know, racism, race-based policies, you know, has nothing to do with the health and well-being of a population. It really criminalizes those who are most vulnerable. And I'll leave it to you, Samantha. I wasn't sure how long you were going to be. There we go.
No, I make short work of it. Yeah, so it was born out of racism. This really started honestly back with the introduction in opioids, and this came here in Canada specifically, here on the West Coast specifically. It came as a result when the Great Canadian Railway was finished, and all of a sudden we had all these people that were facing high unemployment, and during that time when this happens, generally the greater community looks for people to start to blame. And unfortunately, they turned on the Asian community that we had during this time, and there was the great riots that happened here in Vancouver. And Capilano has a verbal history of the great riots and seeing all of Vancouver on fire. And one of our early leaders in this country, William Lyon Mackenzie King, I think that was his name. He came out this way and said, you know, we'll get some good of this riot yet, and went back to Parliament and suggested a ban on opioids and the opium dens and all of that. When really that was mostly for the frontline workers and not really for the upper white middle class settlers that were here, that were continuing to use their tinctures. And so we really see how this policy and how specific these policies have been used to target people of color, Indigenous, Black, you know, any sort of substance you can look at. I encourage you in your own time to be able to look into the history of the prohibition. And we have realized through many different experiences and studies and that prohibition isn't effective. It's a war on our most marginalized people. It's $1 billion failure. It's only increased in the overdose deaths and toxicity. It's contributed to further HIV and HCV and survival crime. All of these have been experienced during this, and it hasn't really benefited the people that are having to turn to substances. Treating this as a criminal issue does nothing to support the well-being and the holistic nature that our people need when encountering and using and turning to substances. And we as Indigenous people know exactly what that experience is, as unfortunately a lot of these substances that our community uses were introduced at a time where the center, the heart of our community was taken from us, our children, dating back to residential schools. And we know in community too the impacts that prohibition can have. We realize that prohibition has that correlation with potency. And it's been something we've known throughout time. If we look at prohibition of alcohol in the United States, the most common drink before prohibition was beer. And then during prohibition, it turned into moonshine, right? That was the most popular drink during that time. So Canada's war on drugs, or any war on drugs as concept, is really more based on a system of control rather than a focus on the well-being of the community. And that's essentially what we really wanted to highlight from here. So when we look and we talk about the real harm behind drugs, there are certain things that people consider or would view and have come up as harms that's perceived. Sorry, my words are coming to me slow today. Things like euphoria, withdrawal. However, things like overdose, viral infections, bacteria infections, violence, illegal activity. That's really what the war on drugs has perpetuated. And unfortunately, or in the experience of drugs, we don't even always see the impacts of euphoria or withdrawal. And it reminds me of a story that Len shares. Is one of his, I think it's his cousins, or maybe it was his brother, gave him a THC weed brownie or something, and he took it, and he can definitely tell you he was not experiencing euphoria and he absolutely was not experiencing withdrawal. And so we know that these aren't always the experience of the drugs themselves. However, the war on drugs perpetuates this, the illegality, the hiddenness, the siloedness of these, and contribute to overdoses and infections and survival crime and violence. That's where we really see the war on drugs. Just emphasizing that. So in terms of the Indigenous lens and the Indigenous experience, I can just share a bit from my story and my personal experience with my family and my relatives and how I grew up. And it's not a unique perspective, and that's something that I always like to mention at the beginning of my conversations and sharing of my story. I was part of the millennial scoop. I was taken away from my parents in the late 90s after I was born. And my family members, my biological mother and father, have gone through a great deal of trauma in their life. My dad was part of the 60s scoop and was taken away from my grandmother on the island and put up for adoption in Vancouver so that no one could take care of, no one in our family could take care of him. And my mother grew up incredibly impoverished and one of 7 children on my mother's side, and had some pretty horrific experiences and encountering different cycles of violence and abuse and in her life. And so by the time my parents met, they were already experimenting and established in their relationship with substances like alcohol and different drugs as well, or substances. I was the result of an epic party, and because I have to live with that knowledge, so do you. But through that, my parents decided to stay together, and they recognized the need to come together to be able to support me. But it was pretty difficult as really young parents at that time to navigate raising a child and still being early 20s and not having a lot of stability and options. So unfortunately, some of my family had lapsed back into their use of substances, and I was breastfed. And so I was consuming the tainted milk, and as a result, I was getting pretty bad seizures and had to be taken from my family. And during this time, I was placed in foster care. And growing up in that, I didn't really have a full understanding of my experience with the foster systems, because I was only in there for about 3 years, which sounds like a long time, especially as an infant. But my father and my adoptive grandparents were fighting for custody and won joint custody of me in the end. Um, but my experience growing up as a young Indigenous child in Surrey with a white adoptive family in a very white neighborhood, where I was being raised in the corner of South Surrey, um, looking at and wondering why, all the other children didn't look like me, um, and looking at the fact that all of their parents were there. I definitely had a pretty cynical view of substance use and people who use substances growing up, and that stemmed from um, my own trauma and sense of isolation and lack of connection to community and to self. Um, and I really struggled with that. And I think that that's a regular experience that a lot of kids feel. Um, is that kind of tension, a little bit of anger, maybe something a little further when you get a little bit more into your teens, start leading to a bit of a resentment and anger. Um, and it pretty much continued. The only person that was consistently in and out of my life was my father. My mother was unfortunately too strong in her relationship with her substances during the time, um, and it was really difficult trying to learn to accept that at such a young age. Um, but when I went to university, and I learned who I was for the first time, and I forced myself to look deeper and to look into myself and who I am and where I come from, recognizing that culture is so important. Um, I learned who I was and where my family comes from on both sides, what languages we spoke. But I also learned something a bit more important, something that fundamentally changed my perspective and my experience and my values in an instant. And that was understanding what intergenerational trauma was. And in that moment that I learned that, in my first year of university, I instantly released a lot of that resentment that I had. And that was really healing for me to learn and understand that and appreciate that my parents were doing what they had to do to keep themselves alive. And so I always talk about this and I like to share this because um, in my own comical way, I like to say that I came over from the dark side and saw the light. That is, being culturally safe and trauma informed and really set me forward on this route, but also having that understanding of destigmatizing people who use substances and having deep understanding of how this impacts us and how this impacts community. And it all starts with this basis of colonialism. And as I learned through university, and learned of the different colonial tools that were used, that really fed into this occurring cycle of addiction in many of our communities. And I can tell you for a fact, my story isn't unique. I've often shared it with many youth across the communities, and you'd be surprised how many Indigenous youth come up to me and say, your story's exactly like mine. But it's all things that we have been socialized through. I'm so sorry. Things like residential school, where we're fed fear and shame, the 60 scoop, and land theft. All this has contributed to the trauma we've been experiencing. And that has really contributed to the reason why people turn to substances. to help them with their grief, to help them with their loss, recognizing that the legacies of residential school, of land theft, of the 60 scoop, the millennial scoop, the missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls epidemic that we're in, our two-spirit relatives going missing, the general health effects and loss and the poverty that we experience in community and in urban settings. All of this has continued and fueled our cycles of addiction. Um, and I always encourage people in any of the sessions, whether it's this session or my cultural safety session, not to refer to these things as dark chapters of our history, because when we do that, we negate the lasting impacts that these tools have had in our communities, and how we're still carrying that with us, and how we, as resilient as we are, we need to encourage our systems to become safer for us. Because when we talk about resilience, resilience is important, but that puts the onus on the individual to change, when really it's our systems that need to change. It's our systems that need to adapt. And this is especially important when we talk about things like addiction, of substance use, of housing, of alcohol use, any of these addictions that we see. It starts with the changing of the system. And what is the opposite of addiction? The opposite of addiction is connection. And it starts with community. It starts with nurturing our relationships with our family and our friends, with our culture and tradition, exploring and becoming closer to our nation and our territory, having an understanding of who we are and where we come from. It's allowing us to learn how to love and how to accept love. It's finding our identity, and finding that identity gives us power, and it gives us peace, contributes to healing. And when we have that space where we're able to step into ourselves in a full, holistic, and cultural, significant way, that's where we see the connection. That's where we see our integrity, our responsibility to one another, our empowerment, and finding our purpose. And then for us as Indigenous people, it all is rooted in our sense of community, because we are relational as people. You go up to any Indigenous event and you see any Indigenous person, especially an elder, they'll say, "Who are you? And where do you come from?" Or "Who are you and who do you belong to?" And that's us trying to discover how we are in relationship with one another. Everything we do is relational. And so it has to come from our belonging and our sense in community to be able to nurture that sense of connection, and how connection can lead to healing and to beyond healing. We have been resilient for so long, and we need to be allowed to have spaces to not just heal, but to move forward in our capacity, in our strength, in allowing us opportunities for love and engagement and enrichment and furthering into, being able to thrive as people. But we know that so many of our community members, both urban and on reserve and remote or rural, many of our community members are still healing from the impacts of colonization. And it's so important for our spaces, for your spaces as well, to have this really deep understanding of connection through community and connection through relationships. And it starts with you, and it starts with how you engage with us, and how you engage with our people. and a lot of that comes with a lot of humility as well, right? I always like to remind us that, especially in healthcare, we're not always being seen at our best, right? And that comes with a lot of, that comes with a lot of courage for our people to ask for help. And it comes with a lot of courage, especially in systems where we know there's been some past harm that our community has experienced. In some spaces, there's still some harm that our community is experiencing, which is why your presence here today and your furthering your understanding is so important. This is the model that has helped my family, and it's helped my father, and it's helped my community to be able to move forward. And I'm really proud to say that my dad is continuing to nurture his relationship with his culture and where he comes from and his language, and has not been dependent on substances anymore, and has been able to go back to work and be able to continue to be here and to nurture me um and further himself in his life. And you know he has always been a strong man, and it took me a long time to realize that it's okay to struggle and still belong. They still belong even when we struggle. They're still on their path even when they're struggling, and that's where that scope of harm reduction comes in. And that's kind of been my experience in my journey through this, and now I'm still dedicating myself to learning as much as I can. But even if I'm not the most well-versed in harm reduction and principles and practices and clinical application, I know from experience the power of connection and the power of love and the power of generosity and creating safety for each other. And I just wanted to thank you for letting me speak, and I'll pass it back over to Jordan for this. But, thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you, Sam. I love hearing you speak, and I want to hear more of you. Thank you for all those stories of sharing who you are, where you're from, and family roots, intergenerational trauma, all those different aspects. I love hearing you speak, and I look forward to more of it. So the next aspect I want to highlight is the rest of it's going to be clinical applications. So I'm a registered clinical counselor, and I work in communities in a lot of different capacities. Sometimes it's chopping wood. Sometimes it's building garden boxes. Other times it's driving a bus. So I work in a lot of different capacities. And just when you're speaking, Samantha, about the importance of intergenerational work, I came across teachings of sweetgrass from Elder William Bousquet, who's from Peguis territory in Treaty 1. And he taught me about sweetgrass, and it really stood out to me. So I wanted to share it. And I fully recognize that sweetgrass teachings are from not every territory. I presented about sweetgrass teachings in a local territory here, and they said, this fits, and there's a lot of really good aspects about sweetgrass teachings, but it's not our way. And so when I think about distinctions-based approaches within the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, we really need to honor all the diverse ways of knowing, doing, and being. So this is just one way I want to share as an offering in terms of sweetgrass teachings that I learned again from William Bousquet, who's an elder. So there's 21 strands in sweetgrass. The first 7 represent the 7 generations before us. The second 7 strands represent the 7 sacred teachings. And the third strand represents the 7 generations after us. And what those 7 sacred teachings are these aspects here: love, bravery, respect, honesty, wisdom, truth, humility. And as I mentioned, this is a condensed version of our 3.5-hour training. And so I just really want to emphasize that, these aspects are really important. And a lot of them are actually highlighted in what Samantha was sharing in her stories. So what I want to highlight about plants in general, that's sweetgrass, but plants in general, I want to speak about my wife, and she's given me permission to share this story. She has a chronic illness. She was diagnosed with chronic illness at 7 years old. Nearly died. You know, pharmaceuticals helped save her and get her in a healthier place. And then we realized this wasn't working for her. I didn't know her when she was 7, but her family, and she told me that, you know, we need to stop the pharmaceuticals because for a lot of reasons wasn't working. And then for 23, 24 years after that, she was on plant medicine, you know, a lot of the homeopathic, naturopathic routes. And, you know, we think about the wisdom and the teachings and the healing properties of plants. You know, I work at a treatment center, and, you know, plants are so healing, and plants are able to support people in ways that, you know, sometimes pharmaceuticals can't. I've had the great privilege of speaking with medicine men and medicine women about the healing properties of plants. And I just found it so powerful. So when we think about the territories that you're in from, you know, think about the medicine men and medicine women there in terms of their teachings, and how Western medicine can be weaved together with some of these indigenous teachings of plants. So she had a chronic illness at 7 for 23, 24 years, plant medicine to support her. And then 3 years ago, you know, there was a situation where she needed to go to emergency. She needed several blood transfusions. She needed scans. She needed surgeries. It was a really hard time in our life, and um, she wouldn't be alive today if it wasn't for all the advanced technology of that doctors offered her, of the all the different people that were in her care that, you know, helped keep her alive today. Um, and you know where things are at now, she's still on prescription medication, but tapering off them and moving towards more of the plant medicine that helped her for the previous 23 years. And you know, I share that because I think it's really highlights, like, you know, how we need both. You know, we need Western pharmaceuticals, and we also need, you know, indigenous medicine and plant medicine to help with some of these things. Um, and so that's just a story I wanted to highlight about this, because it's again that weaving together of indigenous and non-indigenous ways of knowing, doing, and being. The second aspect, you know, I just want to highlight a creation story because I think it's you know, relevant here. You know, creation stories, you know, plants came before us, you know, trees came before us, and then it was animals. Then after the animals, it was us humans, and you know, we're the most vulnerable. And so when I think about teachings I've from communities I've been in, they teach me lots through stories, through pictographs, through petroglyphs, you know, through all these different ceremonies. And what I'm about to share, I've been attending a community for a number of years, and the chief executive officer there, you know, the first year didn't acknowledge me. You know, the second year said hi to me. The third year, he said, you know, your heart's in the right place, Jordan. I remember meeting him in the parking lot, and he said, your heart's really in the right place. And now, you know, we speak regularly, and he's taken me on his private boat with about 10 other people. And you know, we went up to traditional sacred sites in the territory. We went to a different markings. One was a thunderbird, for example. We went up to where traditionally people used to find their gifts. They used to stay for, you know, days, sometimes weeks at a time. They found their gifts in this one sacred place. And so I wanted to share that because when we think about the wolf, the bear, the eagle, the raven, all the different you know, animals and all the different beings of all the territories that we're calling in from, and all the different aspects of care and healing and wisdom, and all those pieces are within the communities and within some of the stories and songs and dances and ceremonies. And I share that because in my clinical work, you know, I was shown all these different places, and it was an engagement tool. So when I show up at someone's house, I can say, you know, have you seen the Thunderbird? What do you think about the pit houses there? Have you seen the cemetery and some of the stories that go along with your family in the cemetery? And so for me is a way of building relationship. And so a lot of this is part of Indigenous harm reduction when we think about culture and tradition. we think about engagement, we think about harm reduction practices. And, in this slide here, I want to talk about a youth camp that I held with a community in the Fraser Valley. And there's about, 30 or 40 youth who attended this youth camp. And there's 3 different sections at this fishing village we were at. One was a fire building station, another was a shelter making station, and then the third was a fishing station. And so in the fire building station, all the youth gathered up sticks and gathered up everything for burning, and there was an elder there talking about the teachings of fire, talking about ceremony, talking about working together, all these different aspects and cultural protocols of fire and making a fire. And in shelter making, it was, how do we work together in a good way where we can support one another? We could have differences of opinion, we could have difference of beliefs, but we still need to work together for a common cause. And in this case, make it a shelter. Excuse me. And in the last one, there was a fishing, and we talked about the first salmon ceremony. Excuse me. Talked about the first salmon ceremony. It talked about again working together. Talk about fishing and all the different cultural protocols that come with fishing. And so I wanted to highlight that because that is harm reduction. That is Indigenous harm reduction. The importance of fishing and hunting and storytelling, artwork, singing, ceremony, spending time with each other. And again, that's engagement and spending time and supporting one another with patience and good communication, meeting people where they're at. And so that's a really good picture of Indigenous harm reduction in practice in clinical work. I included this slide specifically because I think social determinants of health are very important, incredibly important, and giving lots of emphasis, and that's wonderful. I think that's fabulous. Something that's not given as much emphasis, in my view, that needs to give more emphasis, is those determinants of health that exist beyond the social. And that was highlighted in some of the stories that Samantha was sharing as well. What I mean by beyond the social is relationship to land, spirituality, culture, geography, geology, knowing place names. For example, just southeast of me is Chiam Mountain. And there's a lot of stories and teachings that go with Chiam Mountain. And when you know a lot of these cultural aspects, you're much stronger. You're much more grounded in your cultural roots and, and very much more connected. And so I think those determinants of health that exist beyond the social are really vitally important. I'm just going to share a story that relates to this. There was a young person texted me in the evening about, I don't know, 4 or 5 and said, "Hey, I need to meet." I'm like, "Okay, well, let's meet tomorrow morning at 8:30 at the field." So I met her at the field, and she said, "Jordan, I'm getting hurt at home. I'm getting abused at home. It's been happening a long time. I don't feel safe where I'm living. I can't live there, and I don't know what to do." And so her and I ended up making a child protection report together, and we were in the field for about 8 hours. I spent time with her while there was a plan being made. And something she said, I never forget, is, she said, "Jordan, I feel like a bird with my wings clipped. I can't fly, but I want to." And, that just tore at my heartstrings when she said that, because it's, I think a lot of our young people feel that way. And so, I was thinking, how can I help her, feel more supported and cared for where she doesn't feel that way. So we found a placement for her, with a community member, stayed there for a couple days. For a variety of reasons, that placement broke down. Found herself homeless in Chilliwack. I found her in Chilliwack. We got connected with a shelter, stayed there for a couple days. Went and saw her, got lunch, and checked in regularly. Got placed with another family member, broke down. Another placement broke down. And then after the 6th or 7th placement, we found her placed with family, with an uncle who was very culturally gifted in connected with community and teachings and protocol. And I'm happy to say now that, she is connected with the community and the cultural programming and those different aspects going on, enrolled in school, in a healthy relationship at the time. I think it's broke down since. And so when I think about these determinants of health that exist beyond the social, she she taught me about frog leaf, which is a plant on the ground here, and she showed me this is what frog leaf is, Jordan. And so I during that course of that summer, I picked one and I brought it to her and I said, "Is this frog leaf the one you were teaching me about?" And she's like, "Yes." And so she felt so empowered knowing that she taught me something, her counselor at the time. And so I think some of the ceremonies and some of the place names and some of the cultural aspects that she learned throughout, that summer and before that as well, really helped with her healing and her wellness in that placement that she found herself. Um, the next aspect here is another story about a different youth that I worked with. And of course, a lot of my stories are youth related because that was the role that I had at the time. But I spent a lot of time again with communities, building garden boxes, yeah, driving, chopping up food, working in the kitchen. But a lot of the clinical work I find it can be that too. But for these purposes, I want to share some, work with youth out clinically too. So another person texted me. He said, "Jordan, I'm going to kill myself tonight." And so I responded and I was able to, see him in about, 10 minutes or 15 minutes after him texting, and to follow up to check in. And similarly, I probably spent, 5 or 6 hours with this individual. And the first thing we did is I checked in with him. He said, "I'm hungry." So we went to A&W down the street and got some food, just chatting, just connecting and finding ways how I can best support him. Because what he told me at the time is, if you call the police or call the ambulance, or if you take me to the hospital, I'm gonna go, jump in front of that car, or I'm gonna go jump off that bridge. And he says that if you do that, I'm running away, and that's what I'm doing. And so I had to find some creative or alternative solutions to support this individual. And so we spent some time together at A&W, and then I said, "Hey, what's supportive in your life? What are some people that have helped you?" And he's like, "Well, my grandfather, but he died 6 months ago." And I'm like, "Okay, well, what reminds you of him?" "Well, fishing." And so we went to his grandfather's fishing spot, driving up this road, 10 or 15 minutes, walking down this path. And we probably sat in silence, him and I, for 30 minutes, 45 minutes. And during that time, he says that his grandfather spoke to him at this fishing spot, and he said, "It's going to be okay, Sonny." And after that happened, him and I spoke a bit more, and he's like, I'm feeling a bit lighter, and I'm feeling that it's not so pressing anymore. And for me as a counselor, I'm thinking, we got to create a better system of care around him, a better plan, because I didn't feel confident in that answer that he wasn't gonna kill himself that night. And so over the course of that, 4 or 5 hours, we were able to bring together, I think, 8 people, maybe 10 people, who was able to support him over the next 24 hours. Um, and so after, I was with him, we saw his grandmother, and his grandmother knew what was going on. We went and saw his mother. She let her know what was going on. Um, and this was all guided by him, by the way. He really thought it was important to go and do this together. And so after I was with him and spent time connecting with these other people, the other family support workers, like, "We're going out for dinner." The direct handover from me to the family support worker, they're going out for dinner. And then one of the staff in that community says that, there's a lot of there's a lot of people that die in her community. And so she says, "I'm going to stay up all night because, I don't want him to kill himself. I don't want, this to happen again, because it happens nearly weekly in this community." And so saw me, and then went for the family, with the family support worker for overnight. And then there's another person said, hey, I'm gonna go play video games with them. So again, there was a big wraparound care system for until the following morning when I saw him again for 4 or 5 hours. And the same kind of thing happened for I think 2 or 3 days. And then all of us agreed, we're feeling more comfortable with him in his where he's at with mentally, where he's at with his substance use, where he's at with these aspects. And I share that because I've used the ambulance and police and the hospital for many different youth that I'm working with, but I want to share this story specifically because it highlights the importance of community, and working together, and that Indigenous people know how to take care of Indigenous people. That was another story I wanted to highlight. And last one, and then we'll have some time for some questions and answer, some comments, and a summary as well. So this last story, another young person I worked with who was in a psychiatric facility for a number of months, and this was part of his discharge planning meeting, and the facilitator there invited folks from that facility, great, and then also invited a lot of his natural and family and community supports from where he was from. I thought that was fabulous, including everyone. And so the meeting happened, and the facilitator asked the elder of this individual's community. I said, what would you like to share? Because we want to hear what you have to say. Excuse me. So this elder spoke up and probably spoke for 10 minutes about how the individual was connected with sports, their family, and all their teachings and their gifts, talking about the community that they're from and the family lineage and different medicine men and women in their life. Spoke about different experiences of that they've had with them and some of the gifts that this individual brings. And I thought it was fabulous as I was listening to this. And then after the elder finished, the facilitator is like, okay, and then turned directly to the psychiatrist at the time and was really dismissive to this elder and really didn't validate any of the things that she was saying. It was really just going right over to the psychiatrist at the time. And after the meeting, I was in the same meeting as I mentioned. I went and checked in on her, and the elder said that she feels hurt, that she doesn't feel valued, that she couldn't even work for the rest of the day. I remember her walking out of the building crying and says, I'm going home because I can't handle this. I'm too hurt. And so she went home for the day. And so I share that because the facilitator did really good, including the natural supports, family and community supports, did really good in inviting them to share, but what was really dismissive of the family and cultural connections and the elders' words. And so when I share that story, because I think it's vitally important to honor and recognize both ways of knowing, doing, and being, and recognizing that yes, psychiatric medications are really important and can help this individual, but also some of the plant medicine that she was mentioning, and some of the other cedar brushing and going in sweats, some of these aspects as well, and just to include folks in a respectful way and their knowledge that they do have. I know Samantha has much more cultural credentials than I do, so I think we balance each other out really well, in some of the aspects she's sharing. So in these 6 stories, firstly, I shared about my wife, weaving together Western Indigenous knowledges with pharmaceuticals for her and the plant medicine. Secondly, I talked about the awareness of local territory and how valuable it is to know place names, to know the pictographs in the territory, to know traditional language of sacred sites, these kind of aspects. And I shared about my experience on the boat. Culture is healing. I talked about a fishing village story about the fire, the shelter making, and the fishing, and how this culture is healing and part of Indigenous harm reduction. The next story, I talked about that individual who had 6 or 7 different placements throughout the summer, and really looking at those determinants of Indigenous people's health, not only the social determinants, as I mentioned, but those that exist beyond the social, the relationship to land, spirituality, knowing place names, geography, geology, those aspects. And then I talked about the individual who said, I'm going to kill myself tonight, Jordan. It would create a care system, a community of care around him. And that, Indigenous people know how to take care of Indigenous people with a community, with holistic nature. We need to access the emergency when we need to access the emergency. But in that scenario, we were able to create 8 or 10 people around him for a couple of days to keep him safe. And happy to report, he had a job last time I speak with him. He was in a healthy relationship, going to school, playing basketball, a lot of these things. I'm happy to report that too. And lastly, I talked about this psychiatric facility and being discharged from a psychiatric facility, that discharge planning meeting, and how that elder felt hurt, and the importance of respectfully including family, respectfully including the community, and honoring those diverse knowledge systems that we know is within the Truth and Reconciliation Calls to Action number 22. The recognition and implementation of Indigenous healing practices within healthcare. And when we think about UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, Article 24.2 states that Indigenous people have the right to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, and the province has the responsibility to ensure the full realization of that right. And there's other aspects too that are highlighted when think about the In Plain Sight report. Think about what Samantha mentioned in terms of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and the pathway to hope in terms of supporting Indigenous-led solutions. A lot of these aspects, and so I just wanted to highlight some of those. And this comes to the end of the PowerPoint, and I think in terms of a summary. I'm wondering, Samantha, if you're there, any thoughts or any comments or anything that comes to mind for you from what we shared in terms of a summary from today's presentation. And also we do want to open it up to everyone else. I can't see any questions in the chat or in the Q&A, but we intentionally wanted to spend time and have time for some chat at the end as well. So I'll pause here just if anything comes up. I don't know if Gracie's here. I know she was coming in late. Douglas.
Sorry, just before we go into questions, Douglas, I'm sorry to put you on pause. I just wanted to thank you, Jordan and Samantha, both for your presentations. I would like to invite everybody to submit any questions they have into the Q&A box at the bottom. Gracie has joined us. If you want to give a little wave, Gracie, Jordan, I'm not sure if you can see her.
Can't see her, no.
She's one of the green tiles there. For those of you that aren't aware, Gracie Kelly is the liaison of our Indigenous Pacific Anti-Racism, Cultural Safety, and Humility team that takes the lead on some of our education programs and has worked along with us to make this webinar possible this evening. So Gracie, unless you would like to add anything,
Sure.
we can move into the questions.
Sure. Just apology for my tardiness. Boy, I sure appreciate just the words and sharing from Samantha and yourself, Jordan, on just these heart words, these teachings that really create that wonderful space that Indigenous do take care of Indigenous, and we have developed over the years what will work best. Right? We have, and also we will continue to learn to create what will work best for us to have those health and wellness journeys throughout Turtle Island, and knowing uniquely that a lot of our locations are not the same. And so I appreciate your acknowledgement of the TRC, the calls to action, and the UNDRIP. Really getting familiar as to what do they mean and how can we integrate that into our work. And I also wanted to acknowledge in part of your summary, you shared Indigenous knows how to take care of Indigenous. So I just wanted to put a handout of gratitude to say I'm here for both of you as well. You know, to acknowledge that that we know how to support each other. So I'm here to create that space. And we can move on now to any questions. So just acknowledge this beautiful sentiment of these words and sharing. And also, you know, the diagrams really help put it in place. And it may take a little bit of time to develop what does that all mean. And over time, we kind of develop it in a way that makes sense to us. And I see those words of common approaches so often. And I feel that we need to develop that a little bit further. So hands up to you both.
Thank you, Gracie, and thank you for your patience. Douglas, if you'd still like to ask your question, please feel free to unmute yourself.
Thank you very much, because I was typing this manuscript here for you in the Q&A. You know, like whether you have a spectrum from food to medicine to substance to drug to toxin, and all of these are, you know, they're chemicals, and they have biological, psychological, social, and spiritual effects on people, and sometimes positive in one area and negative in the other. So there's a bit of a balancing issue there, and they affect different body systems different ways. So, you know, I think the issue is, you know, how do we reduce harm to individuals, but also to communities?
Mm-hmm.
Because individuals are part of communities, and so there's always that weighing. Like Stolkson gifted the teachings of the Musqueam to the PHSA where I work, and one of those is I Schlaxen, which is good medicine. And be good. And it's not just good, it's like to be good medicine to each other. And I appreciate your perspective on the effect of colonialism. And I completely, you know, I don't know if I completely understand that, but I understand that. And there's also the concept of enclosure, which is basically what the elites did to their own people in their own countries before they moved overseas and did it to Indigenous peoples in North America. So there's, you know, the cultural trauma. So I'm just wondering, how do we take, like, your stories are fantastic. How do we as physicians take that into practice in helping to solve the issues related to the opioid crisis, for example? Like, it's a super complex problem, and I'm sure you won't have the answer, but you've obviously got insights from the work you've done. And I've done research in this area. I've been in practice for 30 years. I've dealt with patients with complex problems with opioid use, abuse, and addiction. And when I've searched for help and answers, I'll go to 5 different places and I'll get 5 different answers. Maybe more of a comment than a question, but I think part of it is just a reflection of the spiritual crisis of our current world.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much.
We did have another question come in very similar, in how we can weave these Indigenous health approaches into the Western practice of medicine in a way that is respectful and practical. So Jordan, Samantha, I'm not sure which one of you would like to.
I'm happy to jump in first. I don't know if Samantha's there, but I really like to hear what she has to say as well. The first thing that came to mind for me for those questions, first of all, I came across a book by Dr. Eduardo Duran, Healing the Soul Wound, and I found it very impactful for me, looking at those spiritual wounds, looking at those soul wounds. Locally here, there's an elder, and she'd be okay with me sharing her name. Her name's Nancy Patricia Charlie from Sta'alis First Nation. There was a cultural training program I attended there called Tetzawatl. And she walked over, this was done in the longhouse. And no, she walked over to the table. It had a number of different things on it. She picked up sage and she picked up sweetgrass. And in the other hand, she picked up a ceramic church and a ceramic cross. And she said there's many ways to yek with it, to heal and to straighten out. It needs to be done with Squalowin, with good heart, good mind, and good feelings. And I know that's you probably um, when I think about answering questions, I always try to think about elders and what would they say. Another elder that I spent time with, Kutwimaluk is his name, Dr. Francis Horn. He talks about love and forgiveness and how the teachings come from water. And when I think about these different aspects, I am reminded of Letsamot, with one heart, one mind, one spirit. And I share these aspects, knowing that our elders, our knowledge keepers, and people with lived and living experience know so much about this. I work at a treatment center as well called Tulmuk Autuk at Sta'alis First Nation, and in a lot of our programming and a lot of our services, the people with lived and living experience help inform us and inform our work. And so when I think about the expansion and the growth of the PAC teams, for example, peer assisted care teams throughout the province, I'm really encouraged by that because I think peers have a lot of wisdom and voice. I've heard them called the first responders. They're the ones who are in the tent when someone overdoses. They're there reversing the overdoses before the ambulance gets there. And so those are just some things that come to my mind in terms of you know, weaving together in a good way, recognizing that there's many ways to heal, and it needs to come from that place of good heart, good mind, and good feelings with some of those principles that I lined out earlier. Samantha, I'm curious about your thoughts on this question as well.
Mhm. Yes, thank you, and thank you for bringing this question forward. Um, I think I work in I work in a couple different sectors within the healthcare in BC, and something I've noticed and something I always gently encourage us is to practice a bit of patience. It's really common in the healthcare fields to be very prescriptive because we want to help people, right? We want to help people. We want to save them. We want them to feel better. We want them to leave with good health. We want to, bandage their wounds. We want to refill their prescription. We're very prescriptive in this sector, and I think allowing there's I could kick myself because I'm trying to figure out which elder said it, but an elder once shared with me, sometimes we need to slow things down to let life in, to breathe life into the work. And I think a lot of this work that we have to do together in this sector in healthcare comes with that relationship building, and that doesn't necessarily happen overnight. And especially I always say that there's kind of a fine line between this this rapport we're trying to create with our clients, and the relationships we need to build with the people, the human that comes into our spaces, seeking services and seeking care and safety. Um, and a lot of that comes with, I guess, in our own good way, in our own good time, in our own good path, finding ways to kind of decolonize our perspectives on how and what our approach to care looks like, and what our pedagogy around care means to us and our individual practices. And but in terms of how can we weave this together into our work, and it reminds me a lot of what Jordan was sharing, is that good weaving, the balance of Western and traditional. I think allowing people, Indigenous people, into your spaces is also a really great way to start. Whether that's structurally within your organization, finding capacity and opportunity to advocate for the creation of Indigenous specific positions, or inviting knowledge keepers in and having trainings, advocating within your own teams, your own departments, to be able to have really beautiful knowledge keepers come in and share about medicines. It's about connecting with your Indigenous coordinator, what is it, patient navigator, I think that's the word. It's about being able to know your resources, and to be able to approach those good relationships with them, and finding out who your accomplices are. Right? There's this word that we like to use about finding out who your accomplices are in your departments, whether they're Indigenous, or they're just really good accomplices that are committed to this work, they're looking to advance the very same things you're talking about in terms of weaving these together, that has some ideas or has some connections. It's about finding your people that will support you in this, and that's something that I've also realized is, it can feel like it's a lot to engage with this, and this concept of decolonizing all of healthcare seems pretty daunting. But I want to assure all of you that you're not alone in this, and it's not going to be perfect, as much as we'd like it to be. We as Indigenous people are still learning what good means to us, and how to be good in relationships with each other and with our good neighbors, and our good healthcare people, and our community members. And so, because we don't have it figured out, how could we possibly expect you to? So I think a lot of humility and a lot of gentleness in this work is really important too, but all supported by this one quote that we always share towards the end of this session, and it's from Dr. Gabor Mate, and it says, safety is not the absence of threat, it is the presence of connection. I'll just leave you with that.
Thank you so much, Samantha. That was really beautiful. Throughout this evening, when you were both sharing your personal stories, I was reminded of a few stories that I have been fortunate enough to hear as well. And Samantha, you were talking about defining periods of one's life as a dark chapter, and that you would advise sort of against that line of thinking, because it doesn't acknowledge the fact that the effects of that chapter are still ongoing today. And one of the elders that I used to work with when I worked for the Tsleil-Waututh Nation always used the 7 generations teaching as well, Jordan, and would include especially that it takes 7 generations to heal. So when that lesson is referring to the 7 generations that come after, that is how long that they believe that the effects of trauma, that the effects of residential schools, colonialism, addictions remain in the DNA of their family members through consecutive generations. So with that lens on it, it is very much not something that we can necessarily fix in one person. It does take an entire community. It takes the entire system to build spaces where that healing can take place for the next 7 generations. And then there was also a wonderful comment made by Gloria Harding, who is one of the participants. She just wanted to note that the use of opioids is not a high, it's an absence of pain. And for those of you who don't know, we also hosted a community-based experiential learning session last week for physicians on the Cowichan territory of Samana. And I was going through some of the feedback that we have received from the session, and there was an incredibly poignant comment made by one of the participants, and it's anonymous. So but it was from a physician lens, and they said, I constantly feel as though I am being asked to anesthetize people to the effects of their trauma with psychopharmaceuticals, sedatives, and pain meds. Giving the medications is effectively participating in the continuation of white supremacist oppression. And that was that was quite the statement. Not sure if either of you wanted to comment on either of those things in terms of opioids and how they may also be overprescribed at times in the current system.
You want to take a stab at it first, Samantha?
Sure. Yeah. I think it kind of comes back to, I think there's a lot of structural need for support for people in the healthcare sector. I think that sometimes, it's not always feasible or within the good balance, as we say, to be able to take 6 hours to talk someone off the edge, like what Jordan was sharing earlier, and about and from what I've heard from different facilities of how they only have 15 minutes for a consult or an intake, and all these different bureaucratic things that we're limited to. And I think that sometimes our experience is sometimes our people kind of go through those cracks a little bit. And we do have research and data that shows that for many marginalized communities. And I think that a lot of that should come with more supports for physicians and people in those positions to be able to have the time to afford to provide and learn with the guidance of the holistic care approach. I think the narrative that we have in Western medicine spaces is often lacking in that holistic approach. And we recognize that there needs to be more supports for people looking after people, but there also needs to be more supports available for people looking for the deeper, holistic, complex needs that we have. And that's not easy, and it's not easy to tackle, and it sure is gonna need a lot of elbow grease in terms of policy and implementation and all the different leaderships. And for as a young person, I say that's pretty unfortunate that we have these systems we have to abide by when and we know in our community that when that happens, we run the risk of leaving people behind, right? Many marginalized communities, but particularly Indigenous people, people of color, people with disabilities. This is something we realize. People within the queer community, and unfortunately, the need for action and response and advocacy and the need for our accomplices is so high, because in our communities, when we leave people behind, often that correlates to loss in our community, right? And so I'm going off a bit of a tangent here, but all of it is connected. And I think that we need to be able to provide tools to understand holistic care and why it's so important, especially for Indigenous communities, that decolonization piece that's led from larger sectors like Doctors BC and like management within your own respective centers and hospitals or care or clinics, wherever you choose to do your good work. There needs to be that understanding of holistic care, but specifically decolonized lens of holistic care, and that looks at providing that Indigenous lens. It means understanding two-eyed seeing. It means having a fundamental understanding of our values. as
Mhm.
Indigenous people and bringing community in to be able to lead and support them.
That actually leads us very nicely into our next question. We just have time for probably one or two more. But the question was, and both of you sort of spoke to this, so Jordan, you maybe a little more so, but they're asking if it would be useful or helpful to make traditional Indigenous medicines its own field of study, so to speak, so that it can be learned and taught in educational institutions and become a practice for everyone, including non-Indigenous people, similarly to traditional Chinese medicines, naturopathy, and so on. And Samantha, I know you mentioned that there are still learnings going on, and if we don't know, how would they know? And I know there are people in communities who do have that knowledge, but whether they're at a point yet where that should or could be shared for public consumption, I know is another issue. So over to you guys.
I'm happy to speak to that one as well. And it comes from a story, and I was only given permission to share vague parts of it because she was worried of what might happen with the specifics. I know someone in Eastern Canada, and her community was dying of an illness. There was people dying all the time, really regularly, constantly, ceremonies for people who have passed away. And her family ended up finding a medicine that helped not sometimes completely stop people from dying from this illness, and other times help people heal from this illness where they were no longer suffering as much as they were. And she told me the story, and she said, Jordan, I'm worried that if I share this medicine with people, it's going to get stolen, it's going to get exploited. Where's it going to be for my people when I need it? And so I'm thinking there'll be a lot of people who are really supportive, and I think that'd be a fabulous idea in terms of a like a naturopath or a homeopath or a section of that nature. And there'd be other people who are quite resistant of that. I think you'll find both. And I think, yeah, you have to speak about you mentioned two-eyed seeing, Samantha. When I think about knowledge validators and knowledge scrutinizers, that's terminology that Mi'kmaq elder Albert Marshall uses. It's going to be distinctions-based approaches and recognizing that every community has their knowledge validators and knowledge scrutinizers, and that can be the same person. And you'll find that there'll be lots of different beliefs around that. And so I just want to let you know that there'll probably be both in terms of that. And secondly, I just want to speak quickly that when we think about our systems and structures, colonial ideology, it privileges being heterosexual, it privileges being cisgendered, it privileges male supremacy, it privileges white supremacy, it privileges, these aspects. And so when I think about decolonization, I think about decentering that white Eurocentric narrative and recentering our voices of oppressed and marginalized folks, our Black, Indigenous people of color, or LGBTQ folks, immigrants and refugees. So decentering that narrative and recentering of those folks. And one last piece on decolonization I want to share from an article called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. It was written by Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang. Decolonization is about three things. Decolonization is about land return, supporting Indigenous governance, and being led by Indigenous people. And I heard that some of the things you were speaking about, Samantha, about being led by Indigenous people, that's part of decolonization. And so I'm going to stop there because I know we've got a few minutes left. Hi. HKCM.
Thank you. Samantha, did you have anything more to add to that, or?
No, I think Jordan covered it. No, I think that, there's a lot of, different approaches and different ways In terms of specifically in Indigenous medicines and Indigenous approaches, I think it's kind of this judgment and relationship based. We as Indigenous people, there are certain aspects of our culture that we are still engaging in and re-engaging in and familiarizing ourselves with again. And so sometimes when we're in process of that, and we're in process of finally returning to its sacredness for us and our communities, sometimes those practices need to be closed. We have those closed practices to be able to honor that. And so we need to be able to have that understanding of what is a closed practice and what is an open practice. What is something everyone can go and engage in, and who is qualified and whose permission do we need in that work. And that's something that's that's heavily based in relationships is honoring that permission. And that was something that was introduced to us from Jordan tonight. Permission of sharing these stories and permission of sharing these perspectives. And that comes with that good honoring, and that's part of that reconciliation work is allowing us space to reclaim some of these practices that we have. So I would just encourage us to yes, continue in this journey of integrating these perspectives and these opportunities for wellness, and for healing for our people, and recognizing that they're not just opportunities for our people, but for all people. Right. But ensuring that the person leading that is qualified to be able to lead that, has been given permission to lead it, or inviting somebody else in who practices that, in offering and inviting and including Indigenous people in their own health plans and their own, offering that good dignity back to us and our people. And we'll always just say, it never hurts to ask, just to ask someone from the nation or someone from a friendship center or another Indigenous health organization. The worst they could say is no. And it's better than doing it without permission, and it furthers the good relationships that we are hoping that you'll continue to build in your own spaces. So we don't bite.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's often, I think, what people have such trepidation about, is just making that first move, right? And we are at time. I want to thank you both so much for your words tonight. I'm sure we could probably talk for another 3 hours. I wanted to mention to the physicians on the call that Britt has put the link to the sessional form in the chat. I'm hoping you can see what we've posted in the chat. If someone could give me a nod that they see the sessional form link. Yes, thank you. Okay, wonderful. And just want to again thank all of our participants too for spending this time with us this evening, and hope you go away with a lot to think about for your various areas of practice.